Hello. I hope you are settling in nicely. I do hope that you are settling. Welcome back to our third session in Council of Nicaea discussion. In this session, we have two papers. The first one is presented by Professor Natale Loda. Our speaker is a professor of canon law of the Eastern Churches at the Pontifical Lateran University, that is in Italy. His publications mainly focus on the history and various aspects of the Eastern Catholic Church's canonical discipline and on its comparison with Latin law. Also, he teaches ecclesiology and law, focusing on the history and its expressions in the councils as well as in ecclesiastical legislation. The title of the paper is Deaconesses from Nicaea 325 to the end of the 4th century, in which he explores the missionary role of the female deacon and their guiding and teaching task in the church, which is very, very important topic. Thank you so much, and please, you are welcome to the podium.
Thank you. Many thanks to all. The Council of Nicaea, also known as the Great and Holy Synod of the 318 Fathers, along with those of Constantinople, Ephesus, and Chalcedon, were compared by Pope Gregory the Great to the four Gospels, particularly for their authority and having formulated the fundamental dogmas of the Church. It should be noted that in the 4th century, we are still in a time when the communities founded and dispersed through the Near East, not always officially recognized, lived in communion and orthodoxy, albeit with their own pastoral organization, practices, and celebrations. Ignatius of Antioch had already coordinated the different particular churches, albeit in a different local community context, but not closed in on itself, towards a life of faith that was structured around a single bishop, assisted by the presbytery, and supported by diacons, and the diaconesses for women. We cannot help but refer to the first ecclesial structures formed by the domestic churches that represent the Christian community. These domestic churches, which over time organized themselves into structured Christian communities. In their constitutive community, variety demanded orthodoxy, unity, communion, and Catholicity. The consolidation of ecclesiastical structure and ministries centered on the bishop was a primary task, was to maintain communion with other churches, but also with his own community, preserving harmony with priests and diacons, and recognizing the charism of the faith. Community structures gradually specify the different roles derived from the gift of charism which, however, called the reform one local church to another. Indeed, until the 7th century, bishops claimed full hierarchical and functional autonomy with their own communities, even with respect to the Bishop of Rome, one part. Regarding the Council of Nicaea, a decisive point of the orthodoxy of the Church occurred regarding the confession of faith adopted by the Council the 19 June. Other topics of varying importance were discussed at the meeting, such as the resolution of controversies and certain minor inconveniences in the ecclesiastical life, which were addressed the following month. Among these topics, Canon 1.9 presented a solution regarding the followers of Paul of Samosata, called Paulinians or Paulinists, who returned from heresy to the true church. Such heretics were required to be rebaptized if they were clerics after their new baptism, provided they enjoyed a good reputation and had not incurred in any condemnation. They could be ordained again. This treatment seems to have also been extended to diaconisses and in general to lay followers who had come from Paulinism. This solution of the Canon 1.9, which concerned the structure of life of the church in Western Syria, shed light on the situation of ecclesiastical life, making the first reference to diaconisses. Indeed, it was precisely at the Council of Nicaea that the term diaconate appears in an official document for the first time. In the case of the Canon of Council, contains the earliest deliberation regarding the status of diaconisses. This text still faces insurmountable difficulties, but when adopting the interpretation of Greek manuscripts and using additional, more current historical critical elements for recent authors. The predominant view of interpretation this Canon 1.9 was that diaconisses should be treated equally with the priest who had returned to orthodoxy. On the other hand, however, some authors believe that diaconis who had not received any holy orders still belonged to the laity. Furthermore, it seems that the reference to diaconisses who had returned to orthodoxy from Paulinism after rehabilitation would have rebaptized, rejoined the ranks of the laity, regardless of whether they had received holy orders. It is debated whether this phraseology is found in a ordo or ranco as a system with a general provision, a standardized practice, or not. Indeed, it is unclear whether diaconis received the laying on of hands, as in the rite of conferring the male diaconate. This last part of Canon 1a remains open to interpretation, considering the diptych of holy orders did not have its current meaning at the time of Nicaea. Here, we will attempt to address the different interpretation, as the interpretation of fifth provision remain diverse, if not controversial, among exegetes and historians. This article does not intend to summarize the history and institution of diaconisses, but rather to analyze the status quo at the time of the Council of Nicaea until the end of the 4th century. A final note. The term diakonos of uncertain etymology is a noun and adjective with a common ending in classical ancient Greek that corresponds to the Latin term minister. The Italian equivalent could be servitor, or more specifically, servitor at the table, which contrasts with doulos, sclavos, in Latin servus, meaning slave. In fact, there would be not derivation from diakonos, since the A in diakonos is long, diakonos, while that of diakonos, is short. The origin of the term can perhaps be the obsolete form of diaco, diico. Furthermore, one could hypothesize a derivation from the archaic dikein, as in reaching a goal where the term disco means plate. Therefore, the one of collects the plate, but also cupbearer, or dikein from dignimi, which implies the notion of direction of the house. Chantrain notes in Hellenistic epigraphy, the diakons was a servant in a temple. Servant in a temple, very important. It was probably from the service the term was transferred of the first ecclesiastical communities as they established themselves, identifying it and inserting it at the presence of the charismatic gift. The story of diaconesses seems to have a clear reference in Phoebe, called diaconissas. Attention, the man was o diakonos, the women I diakonos. Don't have a diaconissa. Diaconissa is posterior. And in Paul, Roman 16:1-4, we have Phoebe o I diakonos. She is the only woman in the New Testament to receive this title, called to this service. Paul used the expression I diakonos tis ecclesias, which will be translated into Latin as ministra ecclesiae, meaning service to the Christian community or messenger of the church. Perhaps Phoebe was one missionary woman, or one in a house accept the community. Aquila and Priscilla is another this expression, given that it always derives from the recognition of specific charisma, seems to allow for three interpretations. A noble meaning as a title of service of messenger of the church. An embryonic meaning of ministry in the church, including for women. 3, a true office, an institution parallel to the male, one that is taking shape within the church. In the Apostolic Church, when it began to organize it, and also in that of the fathers, the female diaconate was not a strictly ordinate ministry, but rather an instituted one. This means the terms like charisma, ordination, institution, ministry, and office still had a certain interchangeability without a precise definition. Only with the apostolic tradition would actual ordination be specified as the laying of the hands, or more generally, as chirotonia. We have chirotonia, chirotosia. The diaconia, we have apostolic tradition of Hippolytus. Also the didascalia of apostles, the testament of our Lord Jesus Christ, Epifanio di Salamina, the apostolic constitution, and it concerns beside the diaconesses as a mediator between the bishop and the woman. In fact, diaconesses are present in the conversation between the bishop and the woman. Their charitable tasks include providing home care to sick or disabled women, collaborating and conveying message to the bishop and the other service. Negatively, the Apostolic Constitution states that they do not bless and cannot perform anything intended for priests and diacons. In fact, diaconesses do not bless, do not assist the bishop in the divine liturgy, do not distribute communion in the faith, and do not baptize. They only guard the doors and assist the priest in the baptism of women, for the sake of decency and propriety, dia to have praise. I go. We have Karlsbach, followed by Grison and Martimor, believe the Council of Nicaea did not have a right of ordination for diaconesses, so they were counted among the laity. This exclusion, according to Grison, arose from the strong Greco-Roman influence on women, which had taken root in the church. According to Martimor, the reference to diaconesses in Canon 19 was not intended in contrast the Paulinist practice with the Eastern Church, but perhaps to clarify the nature of this institution, which was little known and not widespread outside the Eastern regions. Jean Gallo, believed that the Council of Nicaea, by saying as for diaconesses, considered that diaconesses provided they were irreproachable, could be retained in their position and had to be ordained by the bishop of the Catholic Church after being rebaptized. Since the Pauline diaconissal baptism was invalid, their ordination was also invalid. Therefore, these diaconesses had to be numbered among the lay women until, remaining blameless, they entered the full communion and received a new valid baptism and subsequently a new ordination. In fact, the Council of Nicaea, by insisting on the need for a new baptism and then a new condition ordination, recalls the role and rank of diaconisses. Without ordination, they would have been numbered among the laity. Thus, the last sentences of Canon 1:9 would indicate a specific status which needed to be addressed and clarified. In the vocabulary for ordination and imposition of hands is not the same. One time was together, imposition a man and ordination. The first time, la cherotonia, it was very extensive ordination reserved of bishop to the members of clergy. Regarding diaconisses, this is same as that defined to apostolic constitution, namely the spleen, the imposition of hand with physical contact of the head and a blessing. We have another term, evlogia. Evlogia is a simple imposition of hands with a prayer or blessing performed without physical contact with the person concerned. We have epiresia, election, designation with blessing. We have kathista, meaning institute, designate. Sometimes it was a synonym with hyperesia. Sometimes the term kathista refers to widows who, in the apostolic tradition, were not ordinated. In Latin Church, this was simply a calling to the institution, to a minor office without ordination, but with public commitment. Indeed, the widows did not offer oblation and did not have a liturgical service. You have the other. We have the other hearts, but it's not possible here. At the time of Council of Nicaea, we still had many small communities scattered throughout the Eastern Mediterranean in Rome, leading an ecclesial life with their one specific disciplinary and liturgical canonical norms. The bishop primary concerned the maintenance of orthodoxy and the ecclesiastical communion in the home church, in our community. Although reference to the institution of female diaconate had already been made, especially in writing such as the Didascaly of the Apostle, some obscure points still remain regarding the scope of his scope and the precise identification of its ecclesiastical ministry. At the Council of Nicaea, although Canon 1:9 made a reference of diaconisses, a satisfactory reconstruction of the institution of female diaconate is difficult, precisely establishing their roles, which called vary according to the particular legislation of community scattered throughout to East, as well as their offices and the responsibility, becomes problematic due to the variability of location and the perceived autonomy of the various communities. Certainly, over time, the institution of diaconate, from being an expression of the charisma, increasingly diversified in its ministerial order and its responsibility, which become increasingly subservient to its ancient pagan minimum, expanding for men and restricting for women. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Loda, for this very important topic. It is not usual to bring topic about women to the light, so thank you so much. Our second speaker is Professor Sebastian Brock, a very well-known emeritus Syriac reader at Oxford University who has many years of knowledge and experience from studying Syriac, and truly he needs no introduction. The title of his paper is The Creed of the Synod of 410 and the Quest for the Terms to Describe the Event of the Incarnation. For some reasons, Professor Brock did not come to Erbil, but he is joining us by a pre-recorded video in which he speaks about the reception of the Eastern Church for the Creed of the Council of Nicaea. So I invite you to listen to his presentation, and there will be discussion time afterwards.
The Council of Nicaea was convened in 325 by the Roman Emperor Constantine. This meant that only bishops from within the Roman Empire were present. It was not until the Synod of Seleucia-Ctesiphon in 410 that the Church of the East, situated in the Persian Empire, officially received the Council of Nicaea and its creed. In my contribution, I focus on the Syriac renderings of two Greek verbs in the creed which refer to the actual event of the Incarnation: sarkothenda, in flesh, and anthropopesanta, in hominated. The text of the Nicene Creed in the Acts of the Synod of 410 happens to be transmitted in two different recensions. In the Synodicon Orientale, or collection of the synods of the Church of the East up to the 8th century, and in a West Syriac form to be found in a number of manuscripts. It so happens that these two witnesses to the text of the Creed provide two different renderings for the two Greek verbs. In the Synodicon Orientale, we find eth-tasham, he was embodied, based on gushma, body, and eth-barnash, he became inhominate, based on barnasha, human being. Turning to the West Syriac recension, we find two very different renderings. Lebesh pagara, he put on the body, and Hawa barnasha, he became a human being. In order to discover which recension has preserved the original text of the Synod of 410, we need to consider the matter from a wider perspective and look at how the earliest Syriac writings express the event of the Incarnation, an event which was completely without precedent. As was the case with Greek and Latin as well, there was a good deal of experimentation, and so it was out of a variety of different options that, in due course, certain terms came to be seen as the most suitable and authoritative. In Greek, it was the two verbs, esarkothe, he was in flesh, and in anthropise, he became inhominate, which eventually were selected out of the many various possible choices available. Turning to early Syriac writers, notably Aphrahat and Ephraim in the 4th century, we find a large number of phrases making use of the everyday imagery of putting on one's clothes. The divine word is said to have put on the body of Adam, our humanity, and so on. What is noticeable here is the use of the term body, pagra, and avoidance of flesh, besra, which had evidently had unsuitable connotations. The same Use of the term body, agra, and avoidance of flesh is also to be found in the Old Syriac Gospels at John 1, chapter 1, verse 14, where in the Greek, and he became flesh, is rendered in Syriac, and he became a body. The clothing metaphor is also introduced into the Syriac translation of the Greek New Testament in two passages in the letter to the Hebrews. In chapter 5, verse 7, where the Greek has, in the days of his flesh, the Peshitta provides being clothed in flesh, where flesh of the Greek is actually preserved. Then later, chapter 10, verse 9, where the Greek has, you have established me with a body, the Peshitta has, you have clothed me with a body. In both cases, we have the clothing metaphor introduced. Ephraim, on occasion, extends the use of clothing imagery and speaks of Christ's body as a garment, debusha. Thus, in his hymns on Nativity, he writes, "Our body became your garment." This extended usage, where Christ's body is described as the garment put on, came to be especially favored by subsequent East Syriac writers in the Christological controversies of the 5th century. And for this reason, it's usually avoided in the West Syriac tradition, although surprisingly, it's to be found in the Syriac translation attributed to Barabula of Cyril of Alexandria's De Recta Fidei. In Nosai and other East Syriac writers, garment is often replaced by the more exalted term estela, robe, another word, loanword from Greek. Ephraim particularly favored the verb shara, he resided, normally with reference to the womb of Mary, though on several occasions he evidently had in mind John 1:14, where shara corresponds to he dwelt in us, eskenos in Greek, where the in us later on came to be taken in a whole variety of different ways. When, however, Ephraim has a more formal quotation of John 1:14, he has a different verb, again, he tabernacled, which in fact is found in the Old Syriac text of the verse, as well as in the Peshitta. Remarkably, again also features in Luke 1, verse 35, another key gospel reference to the incarnation, where the Greek has a completely different verb, episkiasai, he will overshadow you. It's possible that the choice of this unusual verb to render two different Greek verbs to allude to was in order to allude to the Passover narrative of Exodus chapter 12, where in the Palestinian Targum, though not in Peshitta, again renders the Hebrew verb pesach, to whence you have the word Pascha, Passover. While a number of other terms are used in 4th century writings, it's striking that the two verbs ethkasham and ethbarnash in the Synodicon Orientalis text of the Creed are absent, whereas lebesh pagra in the West Syriac recension of the text conforms to early Syriac usage. And so it would seem likely that it preserves the original Syriac translation of the Creed of 410 of the Synod. The two verbs in the text of the Synodicon Orientali, ethkasham, ethbarnash, clearly aim to represent a more precise rendering of the two Greek verbs. And indeed, they reflect a much wider tendency in translation practices when rendering Greek texts into Syriac, shifting from an earlier reader-oriented approach, employing dynamic equivalents, in this case, lebesh pagra, full sarcothenda, to a more text-oriented approach, which aims to point the reader back to the original Greek text as far as possible. The process is well illustrated in the history of the Syriac Gospels, where the Peshitta, around about 400, already represents a revision of the Old Syriac text. In the West Syriac tradition, the process was carried further with the Philoxenian revision of 508, and finally with that made by Thomas of Hakel, around about 615, which in effect provides a mirror reflection of the underlying Greek original. A similar pattern of vision can also be seen in the case of Syriac translations of certain Greek fathers. The verb ethkasham is first to be found in the commentary of the Diatessaron, attributed to Ephraim, although it's probably put together by his disciples after his death in 373. Ephraim does, however, on one occasion employ an active form of the verb nafshe gashem. He embodied himself, perhaps suggested by Philippians 2:17. Nafshe sarek, he emptied himself. In the first half of the 5th century, the passive ethkasham clearly came into much wider usage and is found in several different sources. Of particular significance is its appearance in the Syriac translation of Theodore Mopsuestius' Catechetical Homilies, probably made in the Persian school of Edessa in the 430s or 440s. In this work, Theodore has an extensive commentary on the Nicene Creed, the wording of whose text he often cites. Thus, on at least 4 occasions, he quotes the passage containing 2 Greek verbs, and in every case, the Syriac translation reads ethkasham wahwa barnasha. He was embodied and became a human being. The first element corresponds exactly with the first verb in the Synodicon Orientalis text of the Creed, whereas the second element preserves the wording of the West Syriac recension. It should be mentioned that the Syriac translation of Theodore elsewhere also makes use of the clothing metaphor in connection with the Incarnation. The second verb in the Synodicon Orientalis text of the Creed, eth barnash, reflects a further stage in the process of revision. This is to be found in a translation of the Creed made in 501 in Mabug, preserved in a 6th century manuscript containing the Syriac translation of the early Greek councils. In its translation of the Creed, the 2 Greek verbs are rendered eth basar, he was in flesh, based on Besra, and eth barnash, he was inhominated, the second verb being exactly the same as the second verb in the Synodicon Orientale. Putting together the fact that the translation was made in 501 in Mabug, whose bishop at the time was Philoxenus, and the fact that Philoxenus himself uses both verbs frequently in his later writings, together with his known interest in revising the Syriac Gospel text, it seems reasonable to suggest, along with André de Halle, great scholar, that Philoxenus was also the motivating force behind the revised text of the Nicene Creed in the translation made in Mabug in 501. If this is indeed the case, it immediately raises the question, how does a neologism closely associated with Philoxenus of Mabug, a strong polemicist against the diophysite Christology of the Church of the East, how does it come to be used in the Creed as preserved in the Synodicon Orientale? Before attempting to answer this dilemma, it's worth looking back to the evidence presented so far in order to plot the various attested stages in the development of the Syriac text of the Nicene Creed, insofar as the 2 Greek verbs, sarkophendo and anthropis, are concerned. So stage 1, lebesh pagra wahawa barnasha. He put on the body and he became a human being. This is witnessed by the West Syriac recension of the Creed of the Synod of 410. Then stage 2, Eth Kasham plus Hawa Barnasha. He was embodied and he became a human being, witnessed by the Syriac translation of Theodore of Mopsuestia's catechetical homilies. Stage 3, Eth Kasham and Eth Barnash. He was embodied and he became in homine, witnessed by the East Syriac recension of the Creed of 410. And then stage 4, Eth Basar and Eth Barnash. He was enfleshed and he became in homine, witnessed by the Creed in the translation made in Mabul in 501. It should be noticed that several other neologisms were around at the same sort of time, and these turn up in the writings of Philoxenus and others, both East and West Syriac authors. But they were never widely adopted, and examples would be Eth Pagar, he was embodied, or Eth Pagran, he became bodily. One would have thought that either of those would be acceptable, but they didn't last for long. Since the two terms Eth Basar and Eth Barnash had their origin in what was likely to have been a polemical context, it's perhaps surprising to find them sometimes adopted by East Syriac authors. An initial awareness of the two neologisms will, of course, have reached East Syriac writers by way of polemical literature, but their appearance in due course in Syriac translations of non-polemical Greek texts will have led to their polemical origins being forgotten, with the result that East Syriac authors eventually came to make use of them themselves. And the outline of that gradual reception into the Church of the East can in fact be chronologically plotted. The two neologisms are not surprisingly absent from Nasai, who may or may not already have died by 501, the date of the translation of the Nicene Creed, with the two neologisms made in Mabul. Nasai's own usage, best exemplified in his memoir on the Nativity and on John 1:14, involves a range of different verbs, including shara, lebesh, again, and shkal, for which the object is either pagra, body, in conformity with older usage of Afrahat and Ephraim, or besra, flesh, a later usage. Other combinations include rakib besra, he put together flesh, tahti nafshe, he lowered himself. The verb gashem, to embody, from gushma, occurs just twice, once in the passive and once in an active form. The two neologisms of the translation made in 501 are still absent from Kiore, Cyrus, and Thomas, both of Edessa, and from Ishai and Hanana in the 6th century. It would appear that it was through the Syriac translation of Nestorius's book of Heraclides that the neologisms first became known to readers in the Church of the East, probably at some time in the 540s. In this translation, the two verbs occur a number of times, more so in the case of Eth Barnash. Furthermore, the derivative nouns formations, Meth Basranutha, etc., the exact equivalent of Latin incarnatio, and Meth Barnashanutha in homination, both occur as well, the second one actually some 40 times. It's thus interesting that the only accounts of any of these neologisms in Bar Hadbashab's ecclesiastical history is the noun form Meth Barnashanutha. In the various creedal statements of synods to be found in the Synodicon Orientale, we have already met the presence of Eth Barnash in the recension of the Creed of 410, but significantly, this verb is not encountered again until the 7th century, in the letter of Patriarch Kiwargis George, in the second half of the 7th century, his letter to Mina, where it occurs once, though George employs it himself 3 times. It's not surprising to find these neologisms feature in Babai's Book of the Union, of the 2 natures of Christ, that is, though it's only rather sparingly that they occur. Unlike the situation in the Book of Heraclides, Ethbasar is more often found than Ethbarnash, although of the 2 nouns, only Beth-Barnashanutha occurs. And in a passage where Babai is explicitly referring or citing the Creed of Nicaea, then it has the same combination, Ethkasham and Ethbarnash, that we find in the Synodicon Orientalis text of 410, and that, of course, might be the source. Babai might be the source of that retroversion of the wording. Dating from shortly after Babai's death in 628, Patriarch Ishuyab II's letter on Christology makes use of Ethbarnash and Ethbarnashanutha twice each, and Ethbasar never appears. But instead, the older Ethkasham features, along with the noun Ethkashmanutha. And this seems to reflect a wider preference. Finally, I'd like to point to the case of 2 late 7th century writers of the Church of the East, who were not writing on Christology, but on monastic spirituality. Dardisham Katraya and Isaac of Nineveh, who also happened to have originated from Beth Katraya, which was an area where Syrian Orthodox monks were evidently very much active at the time. Both these writers, on rare occasions, use the term Ethbarnashanutha, based on the verb Ethbarnash. In much later authors, however, such as Timothy I, Ishudad of Merv in the 9th century, you'll find the neologisms which seem to become quite widely used in East Syriac authors. To turn to contemporary usage, in the Creed, both the Syrian Church of the East and the Syrian Orthodox Church, we find that corresponding to the 2 Greek terms in the Creed, we find Ethkasham, he was embodied, and Wahwa Barnasha, and he became a human being. So exactly the same in both churches. This stage, in fact, reflects the same stage in the development of different renderings of the 2 Greek verbs as that witnessed in the Syriac translations of Theodore of Mopsues's catecheses and of certain of Cyril of Alexandria's letters. To conclude, I'd like to draw attention to a passage in Babai, where he draws attention to the fact that no single term is going to be adequate to describe the mystery that is in fact ineffable. Rather, he comments, what is important to understand is that each of the many verbs and paraphrases used in the writings of the fathers describes a different aspect of the mystery. And so it's important to continue to employ a variety of different terms, which in combination can help to illuminate what is implied when we use today the familiar term incarnation. Thank you very much for listening.
We are grateful to Professor Brock for having recorded his presentation. And now let us move to discussion time and questions about the presentation of Professor Loda. So, any question? Yes, please. Yes.